Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1, Week 4 of Fall 2020. The topic for today's lecture is cellular metabolism. So the chemical reactions that take place in the cell is what we're going to look at today, and specifically how cells use nutrients to make ATP, which of course you know is a nucleic acid. And then in that discussion, we should talk about why the cells need ATP. So the types of nutrients that cells have access to are numerous. The ones that we as humans, as well as our cells, use in large quantity are called macronutrients. These are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. We also need micronutrients, as do our cells, for chemical reactions, but only small quantities. These micronutrients include vitamins and minerals. When we consume vitamins and minerals, we don't usually break them apart and use the energy produced by breaking them apart. Instead, they usually function as coenzymes to help a chemical reaction take place. So, in summary, the energy obtained from the breakdown of food molecules, nutrients, is used to make ATP. Now, the reason that ATP is important is that it can act as a reservoir of potential chemical energy. That's because it has some high energy phosphate bonds. Now, this energy, when the bonds are broken, is the main source of energy used to fuel most of the cell's processes. So when these phosphate bonds are broken, shown by those arrows that you see in the ATP structure, that releases approximately 7.3 kilocalories per mole of ATP. That doesn't mean much to you and I, but you do understand a little bit about the fact that bonds contain electrons, and when the electrons move during the breakage of the bond, that is kinetic energy. Now, these bonds are easily broken because it doesn't require much activation energy to break them. So ATP is a great short-term source of storing energy, or way to store energy. So ATP can just be stored temporarily in the cytoplasm, but eventually it will be broken down so that the energy can be used to fuel other reactions. So in this particular slide, we see that when a cell breaks down a nutrient, it has enzymes that do that. That energy will go to fuel the production of ATP. And that happens because ADP and inorganic phosphate will combine with the help of this energy to make ATP. So now the cell's got a short-term way to store some energy. If it needs to make a molecule, it's going to need energy. So then the ATP is broken down or catabolized to fuel other anabolic reactions that are taking place in the cell. So cellular metabolism involves catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. So an organic nutrient is catabolized or broken down, and ATP is anabolized or made. But ATP can also be broken down. And when it's broken down, the energy released will be used to fuel another anabolic reaction. Now, our cells function in the presence of oxygen. So these cells have access to oxygen plus the nutrient to make ATP. And the process whereby they do this is called aerobic cellular respiration. So in this case, when the organic nutrient is broken down, the oxygen is consumed, which doesn't necessarily mean it's broken apart, but it's going to be changed in some way. The energy that's released from the organic nutrient in the broken chemical bonds will be used to make ATP, but some byproducts of the process include carbon dioxide, which comes from the carbons come from the original organic nutrients, and water is produced. During the process of making ATP, electrons are going to move from an organic nutrient. And it's this movement of electrons that provides the energy, it's kinetic energy, to make the ATP. So the movement of electrons relates to something we've already talked about in chemical reactions, and that's oxidation and reduction. So during ATP production, oxidation and reduction will occur. The electrons start out in an organic nutrient and they get transferred to oxygen. And if you remember, that is reduction. So the oxygen is what's going to end up being reduced because it accepts the electrons. So oxygen accepts the electrons and therefore it's reduced. The organic nutrient loses the electrons, so it becomes oxidized. The first energy source that we'll talk about that's broken down to make ATP by aerobic cellular respiration is glucose. So we're going to start, that's our first nutrient, okay, glucose. And glucose, when it's broken down, okay, will become another compound and another compound as more breaking down happens. But this energy is going to be harnessed from breakdown to be put into ADP and phosphate to make ATP. Now, the electrons went to oxygen. That's where the electrons went, right? Well, when electrons move, hydrogens usually follow them. So this oxygen is actually going to become water. And the leftover carbons that we see here, many of those bonds are going to be broken. And what will be formed is carbon dioxide from the original nutrient. So when we eat glucose, because that's what we're talking about, getting it to our cells, we eat complex carbohydrates, right? We eat starch and other polysaccharides, complex carbohydrates. And our digestive system is able to break those down into simple monosaccharides called glucose. Then the glucose goes into our cells. And inside of our cells, the glucose is broken down or catabolized. And the energy is used to make ATP, which I've said in a number of different ways over and over again so far. This is the overall reaction for the molecules that we're going to trace. So this is glucose, the beginning, C6H12O6. This is how many oxygens would be required to break down one glucose. in order to make ATP. And of course, to make ATP, we have to have some starting materials. So we have ADP as well as phosphate. Now the products are going to be, the products are going to be, I want a different color. Sorry about this. Okay, here. The products are going to be carbon dioxide, water, and 36 ATP are made from breaking down one simple monosaccharide. That's a lot. And the process isn't completely efficient, so some of the energy released will just dissipate as heat. Now there are 4 steps that are performed in aerobic cellular respiration. When we start with glucose as the nutrient to make ATP, and these 4 steps in the order in which they occur include glycolysis, then pyruvate oxidation, which sometimes we just call a transition reaction, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So all 4 steps, we're going to look at where they occur inside of a cell. And this picture is, I don't know if it's great, but it's the best one that I could find for localizing. So we're in part of a cell here, and the mitochondria is this structure. And outside of that is the cytoplasm. Okay, so glycolysis is the first step, and it occurs in the cytoplasm. So that's in the cytoplasm. The second step is already happening in the intermembrane space, pyruvate oxidation. And the third step, called the Krebs cycle, occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria. And then the fourth step, the electron transport chain, occurs along the inner mitochondrial membrane, particularly where these crista are. But it does happen all over the inner mitochondrial membrane. There are enzymes embedded in that membrane. That's why. Okay, before I go further, I just want to talk a little bit about how we look at these processes. So here's our starting material for glycolysis. It's glucose. That's our organic nutrient. When glycolysis is done, that organic nutrient has become pyruvate. So that's the product of glycolysis. Now the other thing to note is, of course, that ATP has been made in glycolysis. Then in pyruvate oxidation, the starting material is pyruvate. Pyruvate goes into the intermembrane space of the mitochondria, and the product of pyruvate oxidation is acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA then goes into the matrix. Notice that this step, step number 2, there is no ATP production, but we have actually formed our first molecule of carbon dioxide. Now for the third step, we start with acetyl-CoA, and it's very difficult to tell in this instance what the starting and stopping material is, because the reaction is kind of cyclic, self-fulfilling. So we start with acetyl-CoA, and the product that's right here will accept another acetyl-CoA, and it'll just continue. So there is a product that's organic, but truthfully, most of the carbons are going to be released as carbon dioxide. Now, during this process, we do produce ATP, but not very much, even less than in glycolysis. Now, in our fourth step, our first reactant, so to speak, is organic, but it's not related to the nutrient. It's an organic compound that already exists in cells called NADH that has taken the electrons from glucose. So NADH was produced back in glycolysis, just didn't tell you, in pyruvate oxidation, and in the Krebs cycle. FADH is similar, but we usually ignore it. So NADH is going to carry the electrons to the electron transport chain. And so that, I guess, would be our starting organic material. And ADP would be too, but then NADH plus, NAD plus is our product because the hydrogen and the electron is going to be dropped off. So there's 4 steps. You should know, whoops, I have to, second here. You should know the order of these 4 steps and where they occur to begin with. And at least for the first 2, right now you should be able to identify the organic reactant and product. Reactant and product. And here's a little bit about NAD and NADH. So I'm not expecting you to really have to look at this organic molecule again, but this is the structure of NAD+. It's got a positive charge on it, and it's in a number of places, but right here is about where it is. And then, okay, that's all right, it doesn't matter. And when it accepts electrons, we'll see that a hydrogen follows the electrons. And this is where the hydrogen goes. Electrons can go in a number of places, anywhere there's some oxygen, because remember how electronegative they are. They're very greedy. So this is the molecule that's going to take the electrons that are released from breaking a bond, and now it becomes NADH. And this is what's carrying the electrons, NADH, to the electron transport chain. So this is just an overview of how cell metabolism works, why ATP is needed, and the 4 steps involved in ATP synthesis. The other lectures for this week, there's 3, and they will address the individual processes of each step. Thank you.